You have to feel a little sorry for Pontius Pilate. He's just trying to have a career. You know, he's trying to work his way up the career ladder. And I don't know if he honked somebody off, you know, in the imperial hierarchy, but he got himself handed the most fractious, intractable province in the entire empire to try to govern. And he's on notice because he's already mishandled one incident badly enough to provoke an official complaint from the local leaders on up the chain. Which means he's kind of under their thumb to some degree, because Rome didn't believe in 3 strikes. You know, they can wreck his career. Now, he brought it on himself. I only said a little sorry, but still, here he's trying to do his job. And all of a sudden, those local leaders come to him and demand that he put some poor schmuck on trial because they don't like his theology. Which he probably had to bite his tongue to refrain from telling them exactly what he thought of their theology, you know, and his interest in it, because he didn't care about any of that. Rome didn't care about any of that. But Rome did care if those disagreements turned into disputes that disturbed the peace. And here these infuriating old men were insisting that he had to do what they wanted, or else they were going to get him fired. So like any good bureaucrat, he goes along with it. He does what they want. And was that the end of it? No! He's already washed his hands of the matter. Literally, just flip back to Matthew 27:24. But no sooner does he think he's done with it and heave a sigh of relief, then they're back in his office. They got the execution, but that's not enough for them. Now they want him to guard the tomb. Guard the tomb. You might as well guard a manhole cover. But he has to deal with them somehow, and he has to keep them happy. Now there are a couple different takes on what exactly it is that he does. Because if you just translate the Greek just straight up literally with as little interpretation as you can manage, what he says is, have a guard. So is he telling them they have a guard, or is he, agreeing to their request to have a guard? It could mean you have the temple guard, you go take care of it yourselves, and that is how the ESV interprets it. But it could also be, fine, have a guard. And so the NIV, for instance, translate this as take a guard. Now the thing is, as you saw at the end of our passage this morning, when the whole thing's done, the guard have to go into the city. They talk to the Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders bribe them to say that they fell asleep at their post and assure the soldiers that they will back them to Pilate. Now, none of this would be necessary if we're talking about the temple guard. So I think it's really pretty clear that Pilate here gives the Jewish leaders exactly what they want. He gives them a squad of Roman soldiers to seal and guard the tomb. In other words, Pilate gives them 16 members of the greatest fighting force on the planet. Standard watch schedule, they would break into 4 watches of 4 men each to secure the area through the night. To give you an idea of the significance of this, a single squad of Roman soldiers, if cut off from the main body of the army, was supposed to be able to form square, 4 men on each side, and hold that ground against any number of enemies indefinitely. Guarding a 2-ton stone would be child's play by comparison. Literally, I think Chloe could probably have handled that one. And, this is overkill. They were well-trained, well-equipped, well-disciplined, well-seasoned, and ruthless. This was far more than necessary to deal with anything that Jesus' disciples could conceivably try. It was, quite frankly, ridiculous. And why? What on earth are the Jewish leaders afraid of? I mean, they claim they want to prevent a hoax, but really? Really? To quote the Presbyterian author and pastor Frederick Buechner, in the not-so-long run, religious hoaxes always tend to burn themselves out, as the chief priests and Pharisees had good reason to know, living as they did in an age when would-be messiahs were a dime a dozen. Even if the disciples were successful in their theft of the body, and even if for a time their claim of resurrection flourished, it could not really flourish long without something more substantial than merely rumor to feed upon. The threat of a hoax, bluntly, would not have been worth their time. No, there has to be something more here. The real fear has to be something else. Something they aren't telling Pilate. Something they probably aren't really admitting even to themselves. I mean, it's ridiculous, but Jesus had claimed to be the Messiah. He had performed some incredible miracles that they had never been able to explain. Yeah, in the backs of their minds, there had to have been this worm of doubt whispering to them, what if you're wrong? What if Jesus actually was telling the truth? What if, as inconceivable, as implausible, unreasonable as it was, what if he actually was the Messiah? Well, if it was, they had a lot to be worried about. They knew Psalm 110. They knew Psalm 2, which we looked at a few weeks ago, with their promises that the enemies of God's anointed one will be shattered. At the end of 110, we have the language of God's anointed pursuing his enemies in defeat, pausing to take a drink, regathering his strength, and continuing on. And they had just gathered with their families to celebrate the Passover. And so they had recited Psalm 118 as part of the celebration. They had declared, the stone the builders rejected has become the keystone. Was it just possible that they were those builders? And Jesus actually, truly was God's chosen stone? And if so, well, Jesus had worked some powerful miracles. They had no way of knowing what kind of power he had. What if somehow he actually did come back to life? What if even killing him wasn't enough to stop him? And if he did rise from the dead, if he was the eternal priest king anointed by God to rule in the midst of his enemies, to judge the nations and crush the rulers of the earth, how great might his vengeance be on those builders who had rejected him? I doubt any of them had the courage to face that fear even for a moment. And I'm sure they would have laughed in the face of anyone who dared suggest it. But for them to go to such absurd lengths as this, a Roman squad to guard a 2-ton stone sitting in a trench, if they were going to go that far, that fear had to be haunting the backs of their minds and the edges of their spirits. Because if you're afraid of a miracle, how are you going to stop it? Thing is, though, they're going about it all wrong. As Buechner puts it in his sermon, The End is Life, maybe it is not as hard as they feared. I suspect that many of us could tell them that all in all, there is a lot one can do in defense against miracle. And unless I badly miss my guess, there are thousands upon thousands of ministers doing precisely that at any given instant. Making it as secure as they can, that is, which is really quite secure indeed. The point is not to try to prevent the thing from happening, like trying to stop the wind with a machine gun. But every time it happens, somehow to explain it away, to deflect it, to diffuse it, in one way or another to dispose of it. And there are at least as many ways of doing this as there are sermons preached on Easter Sunday. He's right. As he goes on to say, you can spiritualize the resurrection away without much effort at all. It's a metaphor. It's poetry. It's a way of saying the wisdom of Jesus is immortal like the works of Shakespeare, or his example lives on in our hearts, or it symbolizes the rebirth of hope in the despairing soul. All of which pretty, flowery, really spiritual, high-minded sounding explanations miss one single brute fact, which is that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, this whole story is no more real than Huckleberry Finn. If Jesus didn't actually physically get up and walk out of that tomb, there's no foundation for any of that flowery stuff. If he's just one more great leader killed off by the establishment, then his story is just one more telling us that really, whatever writers might like to think about themselves, the sword actually is mightier than the pen when it's all said and done. All too often, we hear people reduce the resurrection to a miracle of symbol and metaphor that leaves the substantial, brute reality of our world untouched. And I'm with Buechner on this one. If I believed that this, or something like this, was all that the resurrection meant, then I would turn in my certificate of ordination and take up some other profession. If I thought that when you strip it right down to the bone, this whole religion business is really just an affirmation of the human spirit, an affirmation of moral values, an affirmation of Jesus of Nazareth as a great exemplar of all time, and no more, then like Pilate, I would wash my hands of it. The human spirit just does not impress me that much, I am afraid. And I have never been able to get very excited one way or the other about moral values. And when I have the feeling that someone is trying to set me a good example, I start edging toward the door. If the resurrection is just a story, it's just what someone wants us to believe. It has no power to change the way anything actually is. And that's the tragedy of modern versions of Christianity. But understand this, it's also the reason for them. The reason we seek in so many ways to defend ourselves against miracle, against the reality of the resurrection, is that just like the Jewish leaders, we are afraid of what it might mean for us. If we can reduce it to an affirmation of the human spirit, or moral values, or the importance of hope, or the wisdom of Jesus, then we get to define what that means. It might not be able to do much for us, but it can't do anything to us either. We've made it something we can control. We've made it safe, tame, the seed of a nice domesticated religion. Miracle blows that out of the water. It blows that wall entirely down into rubble. Even uncontrollable joy is still out of our control. And that can be frightening enough. But if Jesus died and came back to life, not even was raised from the dead by another human being, amazing as that would be, but simply got up by the direct power of God, what is there that he can't do? And if he really did that for us, with all the horror of the cross, what might he ask of us? When he said, anyone who would follow me must deny himself and take up his cross, he might have meant that. When he said, love your enemies, and do good to those who hurt you. He might actually expect us to do that. Jesus laid everything down for us. He turned everything inside out for us. How can we possibly accept that and take it seriously without our own lives being turned inside out and upside down? Even if life is miserable, change is still frightening for most people, because we know in our bones, we know in our fingertips that however bad things are, they can always get worse. Better the devil you know and all that. Even when we know we don't have much control over our lives, our egos tell us we need more control to make things better, not to give up what little we have. If the problem with our faith is that our God is too small, as has been said often enough, it's only fair to admit that we shrink him out of self-protection. Easter shows us a God untamed and untamable, and willing to be completely unreasonable by any human standard. No self-respecting God would do such a thing. What do you do if you have a God who is not self-respecting? We can't possibly know what he might do, what he might call us to do. But the thing is, the desire for control over our lives is just another version of the primal temptation to be our own gods. There is no life in it. It is the road to death. The gospel is infinitely different. It doesn't offer us a tame, reasonable faith that lets us feel we're in control and we understand what's going on. And Jesus doesn't promise us a safe religion with a God who makes perfect sense to us. The gospel proclaims, and Jesus gives, life. Life that has overcome death and will overcome it. Life that takes the 1,001 little deaths that we suffer in this world and transmutes them into seeds of growth. Life that raises dead hopes, dead relationships, dead souls, not as they were before, but better. Not merely earthly and human, but eternal and divine. Safe and reasonable are limited to our imagination. Jesus is good beyond our ability to imagine, and alive beyond our experience of life. He calls us, let go. Let go your grip on control. Drop your defenses, and let the miracle of the resurrection overwhelm you. Let go and live. Let us pray.